My final guest on today's program is Congressman Brett Guthrie, a Republican from Kentucky and a member of the Rare Disease Congressional Caucus. He's also the ranking member of the Energy and Commerce Health Subcommittee. I spoke to Congressman Guthrie just a short while ago. Take a listen.
Congressman, thank you so much for joining us. When this airs, because this conversation is happening a little bit before on February 28th, it's going to be Rare Diseases Day in America. And, it's, I think, bringing a lot of eyeballs to this important subject that 1 in 10 Americans, may suffer from a rare disease. And there are about 7,000 of them. And so they don't necessarily lend themselves to the scale of research and response that other diseases do. And I know that this is an issue you care about. What are the missing pieces that you think we need to fix in our equation of being more responsive to those Americans that have rare disease challenges?
Well, thank you so much for having me here. And it is important. And the one thing is, I have a lady that from my district, Kayla Booth, who came and talked about being the fourth generation with Huntington's disease. And until she came to speak before Congress, I'm not sure I knew what Huntington's disease was. I'd heard of it and did my research just to understand her. And so advocates coming to the Hill is important. I think when they promote cures for the diseases that they have, it makes it we put a face and a name instead of looking at numbers. And so I think that's important. The big thing is just trying to push innovation, particularly in the rare diseases, and where we can fit in, like the orphan drug program, the tax incentives for people to do research, because everybody would love to come up with a cure for Alzheimer's someday, anything with diabetes, because so many people have it. When you talk about rare diseases, I think Congress has to incentivize the private sector to move forward, and like with orphan drugs. There's an interesting thing that's been negotiated in the user fee agreements. I have to look at the Rare Disease Endpoint Advancement Program. That's a big word for a non-healthcare professional. But where they try to pick novel cures or novel advancements to certain endpoints, or not necessarily cures, but endpoints where they can measure success in rare diseases and hopefully be applicable to broader ones. And I'm looking forward to hearing more about that negotiation as we address these user fees in Congress.
And I think another dimension that has come up a lot as I've kind of, done research in this area is concern that the FDA's role oversight, of course, looking at, drugs that are developed and, brought online to cure Americans, but also the safety of Americans and people in general all over the world, that both of these equities are, being taken care of together, but that in the rare disease area, we may not have as much infrastructure of expertise and knowledge on rare diseases within, the analysis, within the kind of community reviews, within expert reviews, and wondering whether or not you think, given the fact that there's going to be new leadership at the FDA, Robert Califf, who's just been confirmed, whether or not this is an opportunity to see some structural changes and some smartening up of the infrastructure at the FDA when it comes to rare diseases.
Well, yeah, the FDA should be the most esprit de corps of any agency in government right now. I mean, coming off the Operation Warp Speed of approving the vaccines, proving that they can be approved safe and effective in a timely manner is what we need to capture that and move forward with that. I couldn't really give you a great answer on how the structure of the FDA is going to move forward with the rare diseases, but you're right. The more rare disease, obviously, the less people studying it that are affected by it. I have a constituent with Duchenne's muscular dystrophy with his son. That's a kind of a rare version of that. And just trying to get studies moving and finding people to participate in studies is difficult to do. But, I'm looking forward to what the user fee agreements come out with, what we want to try to promote with drug pricing and so forth, and try to incentivize these kind of cures to come forward.
Coming back to the FDA debate, and I know it's not, I'll tell our audience, it's not your role to confirm presidential nominees. But when Robert Califf came up, I watched the debate pretty closely, and you had, Bernie Sanders and Ed Markey and Joe Manchin on the same page opposing Robert Califf, probably the only thing they all agree on. And then you had 6 Republican senators, Roy Blunt and some others, that came out and supported. So, they crossed over, and then he was able to squeak by, but very, very close confirmation. And as I think about the debate was a little bit about the era of opioids and the opioid approvals and the fact that one of the criticisms is that the leadership of the FDA hasn't yet shown how it wouldn't repeat that kind of crisis. Now, I'm not going to say that critique is right or not, but it raises a kind of interesting foil between the pressure to try to approve more, approve faster, but also not fall back into what we saw with opioids. Is this something that you and your colleagues in the health world take seriously as well? I mean, I know that your role is not Caliph in the FDA, but
absolutely. There were other names that were mentioned for that position that the past history in the opioid approvals didn't go forward that I thought would have been good choices as well. It's interesting when you see a bipartisan confirmation somewhere where if you have Joe Manchin and Bernie Sanders, you're not really with the extremes, but it is a bipartisan confirmation. Probably means we had the right person. Certainly, there's a big history of what happened with opioids. I've read everything I can on it. Now we have illicit fentanyl that's coming across our border, and we do have to be mindful of it. And we have to be mindful as members of Congress. We see people from our districts like Caleb Booth that I talked about. I can tell you, Mitch Inzer, who just passed away not too long ago of ALS, that let's get cures out. We want it to move forward, and we have to respect the science. We have to respect it. Not only do they have to find an efficacy that it works, we also have to make sure that it's safe and doesn't cause other issues. We have things like right to try this move forward, and you wouldn't want something to cure an allergy that could ruin your liver. But if you're stage 4 cancer and there's something out there that say, this could ruin your liver, but you have stage 4 cancer, there's some risk to take there. And so we need to make sure the risk and reward is balanced. And you're right, we just need to make sure as members of Congress, we're not, and I don't think the FDA just reacts to us on things such as that, but we want our constituents to get the cures that they need. And they often come to us and say, there's this study and it's out there, and my son may not walk again if he doesn't have access to it sooner rather than later. And so we do get those emotions and push, and the FDA has to be structured where they make sure the science is the science. But if people are not going to walk again, or they're at their deathbed, or at the end of their life, or could be at the end of their life, and there's some hope, they don't need to block that as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are things like the Orphan Drug Act. I know there's the Speeding Therapy Access Today Act. There are these number of acts that are trying to create, I would say, a more stable pathway for the rare drug sector. And I think it's complicated. I spent a lot of time looking at this. The economics of it are really complicated, because when you have a need for a small class of individuals, and that's defined at a certain level, you're not going to necessarily get the same economics of scale that
how do you make it affordable? How do you make it where businesses want to produce it? And how do you make it affordable? And things like the Orphan Drug Act and moves forward. The one thing that we don't need to do is get with a drug price. Out there's a dictating the price of drugs as part of the Build Better Act. And we've seen CBO, we've seen other studies say this is going to hurt innovation. So that's, and people will say, well, that's just a handful of drugs and it's probably the broadest use, but that money does fund these other orphan drugs, or these other rare disease drugs. And what's interesting when you start talking to a lot of drug producers, not just always the big guy, but stuff you see coming out of universities that spin off to research and private sector. There are people that spend their life studying just specific drugs in the hopes of someday having a cure for that. And so what we need to do is make it affordable to the patient, because it's going to be expensive for them to move forward. And the one thing Kurt Schrader and I from Oregon have really worked on, and Mark Wayne Mullen from Oklahoma, with the value-based agreements, that I've had somebody come to me that says that I've met with different people that have cures for, or not necessarily cures, but hemophilia that can really change the course of a hemophiliac. And they says, this will save money over the long term. And we're willing to risk it. If they use our therapy, which is expensive, and they don't get the results, the Medicaid program of a state or a health insurance company of whoever is being treated, if they don't get the rewards, then we'll share in it. But and I think that really plays in Medicaid well. A lot of states don't want to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars for one treatment, but if they can get the savings over the course of someone's life, we need to do it anyway, because the person needs the treatment, right? So, I mean, we accept that we need to get the treatment to them, but there are a lot of programs that really get affected by really expensive treatments. But if the manufacturer shares in the risk, and if you don't get the reward financially, the system that we say you're going to get, And the reason you wouldn't, because the patient doesn't get the cure they say they're going to get. We can cure sickle cell anemia now. And just think of what that does to a person's life. And so we just need to have the systems in place to pay for that.
This is going to sound wonky, folks, but I am really interested in what comes after Build Back Better. If Build Back Better is dead, and Senator Manchin says that he wants everything to go through what's called regular order, which means going back to committees. And, Senator Manchin I've interviewed says, our legislation will be better and more informed if we approach it in a bipartisan way, if we give our colleagues across the aisle an opportunity to weigh in and that in the end, no matter whether they voted or not, you're going to have a better package. In your role as the ranking Republican on the Energy and Commerce Health Subcommittee, do you expect some of these pieces of Build Back Better are going to break off and then come back into your committee and proceed and get the benefit of your colleagues' views and amendments on that legislation in regular order?
Well, we would love to see what we call HR 19, so you have HR 3, which we say dictates price to drug manufacturers, which I think if you don't agree to the price, you lose 95% of your revenue, you're probably going to have to accept that price. So that's what HR 3 does. We have HR 19, which has, I think, close to 40 provisions that are bipartisan. So if they came back and said, hey, why don't we move on HR 19? It does things like these drug companies need exclusivity in order to promote and have a reward, so they'll invest. But we don't want them to game exclusivity, so where generics can come into the marketplace quicker. I mean, there are 40. I think it's 40 provisions. I looked at it just recently, but some number of provisions that have a Democrat and a Republican co-sponsor. And if we don't come back and do it in the summertime, if Build Back Better doesn't move forward, and have the fortune to be chair of the ranking subcommittee, if things go our way in the fall, I will tell you, I'm going to push to bring HR 19 or some version of it to the floor, a bipartisan drug bill, pharmaceutical pricing bill that will have big impacts on what people pay. And another big part of making affordable is for our seniors, Medicare Part D, we could do that. Medicare Part D reform, there's no out-of-pocket caps in Medicare Part D, which most insurance plans have. And that would be every American over the age of 65 would see that. Now that we need to make sure it's affordable for the taxpayer to pay for. But just the out-of-pocket expenses for seniors, that would just be phenomenal, I think. And that's something I think you would get every member of the committee to vote for moving forward if they would just bring that up without being part of a bigger bill that has things that we don't support.
And let me just ask you finally, you've been out applauding, and you were part of the 21st Century Cures Act. You supported that. You applauded the work of your Republican colleague, Fred Upton, and Democrat Diana DeGette. In leading on it. I've talked to both of them about it. It's basically science, applied. Let's solve problems. Let's kind of, begin moving. And so part of that is on the science side of it. The other side, we're discussing a little bit today is FDA reform. But I want to know from you whether or not there's another set of versions of those things that are out there. Like, is there more room for bipartisan, let's work and get problems fixed in this, research and drug development area, or is it as toxic and as divided politically as the papers are saying?
No, I think there's room to work. And so the point for HR 19, for example, as I just described, has a Republican, I think every provision,
right.
And we did it that way, has a Republican and Democrat co-sponsor, and we can move that forward. What the problem you get into if you don't want to go down that path, and what we'll have to watch if we're in control, and they certainly did it with HR 3, is put in provisions that aren't bipartisan and just bring that kind of partisan divide. And so if we have the opportunity to have control next time around, I think that HR 19 and what we need to do is say, we need to put forth things that we can have agreement on. And if we can't get an agreement on it, then we don't move forward. Now, I don't want people to come back and retract because we already have agreement on what's in HR 19 as well. And maybe there are other things we can have an agreement on moving forward. But the problem with a lot of bills that seem to pass out of the House, we're about 95% bipartisan. And it's that last handful of things that they try to put in at the end, or they have the ability to do, that keeps it from moving forward bipartisan. But I don't think it's just toxic just in nature. And there are some things that we just can't agree on.
Yeah.
But there are things that we can agree on, and if we just focus on that. So if the Energy and Commerce Committee came back and said, hey, we're not going to be able to move HR 3, so we're going to do the Medicare Part D reform, standalone or some version of HR 19 with just provisions that both sides agree on, I think we would have one of the best hearings and markups you've seen in Congress in a long time.
I love that you know the name of your constituent that brought you to the rare disease area. It's always nice to hear that you actually know your people and you know their issues. Tell us her name again.
Well, Kayla Booth is the one that had the Huntington's disease, and she's young, and hopefully we're going to have some of these rare disease cures to help her as we move forward. The other name I mentioned was, unfortunately, I've been to his funeral. It is Mitch Enzer, and I didn't know them before. Matter of fact, I didn't meet him until I went to his house. His wife and daughter came to DC to advocate for ALS research, and invited me to come meet him, and I said, well, I'm going to do it. So we went and became friends with the family, and didn't know them before until they came for a visit to Washington. And I think those stories are more common than people think. People always talk about all the lobbyists in DC. I'll say the most important lobbyist in Washington, DC is when a constituent shows up from home. And that's how we feel about it. And I think that's how most of my colleagues, if not all, feel about it. And unfortunately, I've been to Mitch's funeral, but that's how you really get to know people. And his wife says, his daughter came into my office. She's 23 now, but she was 12 when she came and said that I know that this is probably not a cure that's going to help my father. My father can't hug me anymore, is what she said. But I don't want a little girl to go through what I'm going through. And so you talking about an effective lobbyist when I guess she was 12 at the time, comes and tells you that in your office, that gets you fired up to get on the Energy and Commerce Committee and try to look for these cures.
Well, it's so powerful, and it's really, really terrific that we can, talk about real people as we're discussing these other heady issues about FDA reform and whatnot. Congressman Brett Guthrie,
well, you got to remember FDA reform is about real people. That's what I want to remind you. Exactly.
So Congressman Brett Guthrie of Kentucky, ranking Republican on the Energy and Commerce Committee's Health Subcommittee, always answers our call to have these smart discussions at the Hill. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thanks for having us here. Hopefully we'll do these in person someday soon.
I look forward to that.
Me too.
Many thanks to Congressman Brett Guthrie, a Republican from Kentucky. Thank you, Brett. That brings us to the end of our program today. A very big thank you to Alexion Pharmaceuticals for its support of these conversations and all of you attendees for joining us today. If you missed any of this, we're going to have the video up from the event on our website shortly. I'm Steve Clemons. Thank you, and be well.